This is the stage where the rubber meets the road. It's the stage where you can start taking the principles and all the dry nonsense I went through. Well, it's not nonsense, but the stuff I went through before actually comes together, and you'll start to see that if you apply the principles properly, it makes a certain amount of sense. When you're talking about bioethical issues, you're talking about specific actions which act upon life in some way or another. And so we have to remember when I was talking about the proportion between the action and the thing that or the end you're trying to achieve. Well, this is something which we will begin to see that there are certain actions which fit human life and certain actions that do not. And how do we know they fit? By looking again at the categories of natural inclination. So if you recall, the first category of natural inclination was conservation of our being as it is. As I mentioned, this forbids suicide because it's contrary to the conservation of our being. Because our being is what? A body-soul composite, and so committing suicide separates them, and so it's contrary to what we're designed to be like. This also forbids euthanasia from the point of view of the person who's engaging. By euthanasia, I mean specifically performing some action whose immediate intended effect is to bring about one's own death. And that also means that you're not permitted to get, so you can't kill yourself in order to avoid pain. You also can't get other people involved in the process of killing you either. So assisted suicide is immoral on the side of the person who's getting them involved. It also means that you can't have mutilation without a sufficient reason. And that sufficient reason is the principle of totality. So, for example, there are certain kinds of surgery which result in mutilation, but they're necessary for the preservation of the whole. But there's also certain kinds of surgeries that are optional or elective surgeries which are not required for the sake of the person's preservation. And those are not permitted unless there's some significant health benefit from it. So also things like plastic surgeries, you can have, we'll see this a little bit later, you can have plastic surgeries to restore the order of nature, but not to modify what you have. So in other words, you're to preserve your being as it is. It means that what? If as you age, your face is sagging a little bit, well, guess what? That's life. But if you're talking about a woman who's had a mastectomy, she can have a breast implant for the sake of restoring the order of nature. But a woman cannot have breast implants without a sufficient reason, that is, if one's been removed or something like that, because it's contrary to the order of nature. It's a form of mutilation. Also, you can't have any unnecessary operations. Two S's, I think, there. Unnecessary operations. And by this we mean, or not medical procedures, but specifically operations. There's a general principle, don't cut a healthy organ. Now, there might be times when there's a sufficient reason when you're not sure if the organ's healthy, and there's a sufficient reason, that is, there's grave cause, look, there's something wrong, we've got to get in there and find out what it is. That suffices. But again, it's a matter of with a sufficient reason, and the sufficient reason is the principle of totality. It's for the sake of the whole. Second, the next one is no contraception. Now, we'll see this as we go on. Contraception is against every single category of natural inclination. But it's against the first category of natural inclination because in contraception, in the case of the chemical ones, you have to actually alter the operation of the faculty. In other words, you have to, by the chemical means, you're blocking the thing. So you have to make a change to you in some way. So you're not preserving the thing as it is. So you're blocking it in some way. This also is the case with, in the case of barrier IUDs, putting aside the physiological damage caused by IUDs and barrier methods, they're against the second and third category of natural inclinations. It is a common misperception that contraception is against the 6th commandment. It's not. It's against the 5th commandment. Because the 5th commandment forbids us not only you shall not kill, but also it's under that commandment that mutilation, alteration of the faculties, and part of it is you cannot operate, you cannot change, you cannot block the functioning of any of the moral faculties, the intellect, will, or those which are moved volitionally, without a sufficient reason. In other words, you can't block them in their operations without a sufficient reason. So you can't block the, again, you could take, for example, in theory, you could take the pill in order to regulate the menstruation cycle, but I always tell people, well, you got deeper problems. So you go to a specialist, you find out where the real hormonal problem is and get that straightened out. If they can't figure it out, okay, fine, if it's necessary because the woman's health is really starting to decline, putting aside all of the chemical problems that the pill causes, you can do it. But there you're talking about the contraceptive effect is aside from your intention, and that you're really just trying to preserve the life of the individual in that case. Sterilization is contrary to the first category of natural inclinations. Sterile. I cannot spell when I get up here. Also, my mom put me, when I was a kid, she put me in one of these brainiac things, you know, where they were supposed to teach you this different way of spelling. They just messed me up for life. Of course, that wasn't her intention. She thought she was going to make me smarter, but it just dumbed me down. Okay, with sterilization, it's actually, in sterilization, you actually have to modify the faculty, and so you're not conserving the being as it is. Sterilization. Here we're putting aside the question of, for instance, if a woman has uterine cancer, the sterilization is a side effect. It's not the act of what you're doing. The act of what you're doing is preserving her life. But when you're talking about when it's a healthy organ, then it's another matter. It's actually what? It's actually a form of sterilization, and so that's contrary to the first category of natural inclination. It's also contrary to the finality of the faculties as it relates to the second category of natural inclination. Because, well, I'll talk about that when we get to the second category of natural inclination. But it's contrary to the unitive and procreative elements, which are structured into the generative faculty. Also, no transgender operations. This needs a bit of explanation. For all of us, it would be nice if we could explain why they do this, but anyway. It is a common misperception that gender is in the soul. But gender is actually ordered towards reproductive operations and those things which flow from reproduction. Angels don't have a gender. God, strictly speaking, doesn't have a gender. We refer to them in the masculine for reasons that they have more similitude with males than females. But the point is that spiritual substances don't have gender. The gender is based upon your chromosomal differentiation. That's what it's ultimately based on. And do you remember when I said that the soul operates through the bodily organ, and the disposition of the bodily organ determines how it tends to operate? Well, when a person gets the Y chromosome, the generative faculty then takes it in the direction of developing the person in a female structure, and the X, of course, other way around, sorry. Y according to the male, and the X according to the female. And so, even though the generative faculty in the soul isn't determined, it is determined on the side of the body. Why? Because remember, it's a body-soul composite. So when people say, I'm a man trapped in a woman's body, well, first of all, no, you're not, because there's no distinction between your body and your gender. And even the medical profession, if you look in some of the journal or in some of their encyclopedias, they actually refer to transgender operations as simulations of the opposite sex. Why? Because they're not truly changing the person's sexual differentiation, because that's actually contained in the chromosomal structure, among other places. Also, I've heard that the medical profession has started to wane on that a little bit because of the fact that they're realizing that these people are just psychologically messed up. That's what the real problem is. So in transgender operation, it's actually what? It's actually, no, you're no longer, it's not a matter of a case of you're no longer a male, it's that you're a mutilated male. Or you're a mutilated female. It's not a case, it's a form of mutilation. It's not a case of changing your gender. You can't actually change your gender. That's why when we had this one priest who was having a difficulty with one of them, and he didn't know how to refer to this guy who'd had this operation, so he kept referring to as, as he or she, or he finally just got to the point where he referred to it as it, because he just couldn't figure this thing out. But anyway, it's a he, he's just mutilated. So transgender operations are against the first category of a natural inclination. We'll see this also, they're against the second category of natural inclination, because gender is ordered towards having children. And so transgender operation, generally speaking, makes them sterile, to my knowledge. And so you're in the end, you're blocking that ability to have children. Although I imagine at some stage you'll get somebody to do it. So, who's had an operation. Abortion is contrary to the conservation of the being of the mother from the point of view of the damage that it causes. So it's contrary to because abortion causes a tremendous amount of damage. And I'm sure you've all read the statistics where it talks about how there's all sorts of complications, and from these complications, many of them it causes physiological damage, so she can't carry children anymore. Or one case of a woman I knew who had an abortion, she ended up with a prolapsed uterus, which means eventually it had to be taken out as a result of it. So the damage from that point of view. Second, another one is this one is always a real kicker, taking a child by C-section without a sufficient reason. And this one is kind of a kicker. If you don't have a sufficient reason, because again you're talking about, because surgery is actually a form of mutilation. I mean, we don't like to think of that in terms. A lot of times they're trying to restore the order of nature and get it as close as possible, but it is an actual mutilation, comes from Latin term mutus, which means to change. So you're actually changing the person, and so it's contrary to the conservation as it is. And by the way, this as it is why, with normal males and females, the women want to remain women and the men want to remain men. If you get some guy who doesn't want to remain a man, you've got a serious problem on your hand. But taking a child without a sufficient reason. So what is sufficient reason? The life of the child or the life of the mother. It's a grave. It has to be grave. So it's not a sufficient reason that because she just doesn't want to go through the pain of childbirth. But everybody I've talked to who's had C-section says, well, the pain of C-section is far worse than childbirth. The women who have had both can tell me if that's true or not. But the point being is that it has to be a really sufficient reason. In cases of doubt, you can err on the side of safety of the child. All right, or on the side of safety of the mother. Organ donation. Here we're talking about on the side of the person donating. When one knows that one has to be alive in order to take the organs. We'll discuss this a little bit later. So now here, by the way, we're talking about organ donation on the side of those things in which the organs are non-twinnable, or there's not twinned organs. So like the liver's twinnable, and there's other organs that are twinned, like the kidneys. You can take one of those, but there has to be a proportionate reason for that, and that proportionate reason is the life of somebody else, and it can't take away your life in the process. So you can't donate all your organs so that 5 other people will live. It can't be done that way. Although you can give like one organ. In other words, the ability to you to suffer the degree of damage of the health, there has to be a proportion between the end and the means. So the end has to be someone else's health is that much in jeopardy. Also, you can't just sell your organs in order to get money for it. That's against the third category of natural inclination, because society shouldn't be trafficking in human bodily parts. Okay, so these are some of them which are contrary to the first category of natural inclination. Then we have the second category of natural inclination, by the way, I hope you can read my chicken scratching. That which is in common with other animals. And there's a number of sins against this. The first is contraception in all its forms. Of course, contraception is immoral according to Paul VI and also the moral tradition. Recently there was an article arguing that that was nowhere founded in St. Thomas. That's actually false. St. Thomas does say that that there are certain there are certain sexual acts to which there's not even union, of which he says is an integral part of the conjugal act. And he says there's also that it's ordered towards life. The fact that they're inseparable, again, remember, the Church says that their understanding of the natural law is more developed. And even for St. Thomas, the union is fundamentally ordered towards having children. That's the whole reason it's there. So for St. Thomas, they're inseparable. But we should talk about that now. This inseparability of the unitive and the procreative elements is based upon the fact that when you look at the nature of the generative faculty, it's specifically designed to have its proximate end, which is union. But this proximate end makes it possible. That is, it's the means. The term proximate and remote, the proximate is the means to the remote end. The proximate end is the means to the remote end, which is having children. And how do we know that? Because in the case of the male, the generative faculty is ordered towards being able to deposit semen, which then allows the woman to be impregnated. So we just look at the nature of the thing, and that's when we know that that's what it is. And even on a physical level, proceeding from a moral level, you see that that's what the trajectory is. But on a moral level, it's the proximate end to this remote end, which is procreation. That doesn't make the unitive higher. To have children is a higher thing than just to have union. There's a common misperception today that's floating around. It's a bit of a problem. People have this idea that, because the Church says that, and of course the moral tradition says that conjugal relations are ordered towards union and procreation, but there's been a slight shift towards procreation and love, where people say that the principal ends of marriage are love and children, or usually love or children. And the problem is that love is actually a tertiary end to the conjugal act. I always tell people, this is kind of funny, when you get married, they say that, of course the Church teaches that you have to render the marital debt. If somebody asks you, and it's a reasonable request, somebody, your husband or your wife, asks you to render the marital debt, you have to. And it's grave, because you contracted bodily rights, so it's a matter of justice. It's a contract. So what does this mean? If you can't stand the guy, it doesn't matter. You still have to render the marital debt. So it's possible to have a completely illicit marital act, although I wouldn't say that the fact that you hate your husband is a good thing, or you hate your wife is a good thing. But you can have a perfectly illicit marital act without, that is, preserving the unitive and the procreative elements, without love. And also there's times when people would have arranged marriages. They would show up on the scene, they'd get married, and then they'd have conjugal relations that night, and they didn't even know each other. That's okay as long as it's volitional. All right. I'm not recommending it, but I'm just saying that, except under certain circumstances. Okay, so contraception in all its form, because it separates, and this is based on knowing the faculties. Remember that discussion. So when you're talking about that which is in common with other animals, to have children, well, that means that if you never have children, that's contrary to the natural law inclination. But also, that's when people get into, well, we're going to have children, but we're going to space them out, or things like that. And that means what? That you actually have to get into the nature of the generative faculty, which falls under this category of natural inclination, to know whether the specific means that you're using to space your children out, or whether even spacing out your children is illicit, because that falls under the third category of natural inclination. Sterilization. Oops. Sterilization is against the second category of natural inclination because it blocks the having of children. So it's a form of mutilation which makes it impossible for the person to have children. It's also abortion, of course, falls under this. Now, I want to say something which really shocks people. Even if it was proven, now I'm going to go into why we think that philosophically the conceptus is in fact a human being. And by human being, I'm not making a distinction between person and human being. I mean the substance of rational nature. That's what we're talking about. Even if we put aside that whole discussion, in the Thomistic tradition, abortion was contrary to the natural law. Even if it wasn't murder, it's still against the natural law because of the fact that you're putting aside, you're blocking the procreative element in the process. Now, if you look at the generative faculty, you recognize that from the time of natural union, then of course there is conception, and then gestation, and then birth. That the order of nature intends that this process is unified. That is, from the time of natural union, there is a single, not a single process, but there's a inherent unified end of the union getting towards the child actually being born, and it goes by this means. And so this is a single trajectory, or it's individual processes which fall under a larger process. And so this is quite important because what abortion does is it blocks the gestational part of it, and nature had intended that after union and conception the gestation would occur. Now here we're not talking about, St. Thomas says that, okay, we all know that not every conceptus actually implants in the uterine wall. Nidation doesn't always occur, so you have to do, so what's the story? Well, St. Thomas says that failures on the side of nature occur because of some defect in us. It's probably the case that Adam and Eve, had they not fallen, would have had a child every time that she was fertile, presuming that the semen did its function. So the point being is that there would have been a lot of kids in a hurry. But the point is that, and that's why God said, conquer the earth and multiply. We're multiplying and conquer the earth. It wouldn't have taken that long. So, but the point is that this is what nature intends. This is the structure of the generative faculty, and specifically on the side of the female faculty, the conception part and the gestation, the birth, is designed, that's what her generative faculty is designed for. It's its structure, it's its nature. So putting aside the third category of natural inclinations, so abortion is murder, that's against the third category of natural inclination. But it's also immoral because of the fact that it blocks the finality of the procreative element. That is, it's contrary to the finality inherent in the generative faculty. Now there's two kinds of finalities, and I need to talk a little bit about this. And by finalities we mean end, the thing towards which something is ordered. Like my ears are ordered towards hearing, or my faculty of speech is ordered towards talking. Now there's two kinds. There's a moral finality, and then there's what we call a purely physical, or sometimes called a natural finality. A physical finality is one in which, if you look at the nature of the thing, it's just designed for a physical function. It's not moral in and of itself. So hearing is not the fact that my ears are ordered towards hearing. If I stick my fingers in my ears and I say, I'm not going to listen to you, am I committing auricular contraception? And the answer is, well, no, because the hearing in and of itself is neither moral or immoral when you look at the nature of hearing. It's what you hear or what you do with what you hear that's the problem. But then there are certain moral finalities. Sometimes you look at a faculty and inherently this thing gets morality involved. There's moral right and wrong here. So like the faculty of speech, lying causes harm to people, so that's immoral. The generative faculty is inherently moral. And by that we mean that the finalities of this union, because the union is the proximate end ordered towards the remote end of procreation, the product of this, the end, is to produce a child which requires responsible care. Therefore, the very nature of the union is to produce something that requires responsible care, and that means that its finality is inherently moral. Why? Because you can't just, pop out babies and leave them on the side of the street and drive off. I mean, okay, some people do it. But the point is that you're not supposed to do that, because this thing you're producing something that requires responsibility. In fact, St. Thomas says that fornication is immoral. One of the reasons, among others, is the fact that you're engaging in a form of union which produces something by its intrinsic nature which can only be properly brought up in the context of marriage because of the education. Remember, that's one of the things, the rearing of children. The education requires both parents. And that's why he says fornication's immoral. It's because it violates not just the future possible rights of the child to be born within the context of marriage. In fact, that's what the church says. Every child has a right to be born within the context of marriage. And why do we know that? Well, St. Thomas says, this thing that man produces, this human being, requires the education of both the male and the female in order to get a right education. Now, sometimes, like if your husband dies or something like that, grace can supply where nature is lacking. And there's all sorts of psychological stuff which I'd be happy to answer quietly to someone else. Why? That's one thing. But to have conjugal relations outside of marriage ends up producing something which cannot be raised or reared properly. So fornication is against against the second category of natural inclination. It's also against the third. So when you're talking about the generative fact, because some people want to just say, the generative fact, that's just a physical finality. No, it's not just physical. You're producing something that requires responsible care. So it's inherently moral. And so abortion is contrary to this. Sterilization, contraception is also contrary because it violates this inherent moral finality of procreation. I mean, if we were just animals, it wouldn't be moral at all, so it wouldn't matter, but we're not just animals. Again, taking a child by C-section without a sufficient reason. Now, this is contrary. Remember this. I said birth. There's a distinction between natural birth and birth in accord with nature. Natural birth is obviously when the child passes through the birth canal. Whereas birth in accord with nature means that what's the finality of birth? To get this child outside to be able to exist on its own. So sometimes, but the normal process is that it should have a natural birth. That's the normal process. But sometimes there's a sufficient reasons, for example, the life of a child, so that you can take it by C-section in order to achieve the end for which the birthing process was ordered towards. And in that case, then the C-section, if there is a sufficient reason, is morally licit. Otherwise, it's against the second category of natural inclination. Then there are certain fertility techniques which are immoral. Now, we're going to talk about certain fertility techniques that are moral later, but the fertility techniques which are immoral. Put an S on that. These fertility techniques act contrary to the finalities of the generative faculties. And here we're talking about the unitive and the procreative and their inseparability. And again, why are they inseparable? Because the intrinsic end of the union, the very nature of the union, is ordered towards having children, and that very trajectory contained in the union means that the procreative element is contained already in it in a certain sense, and in the sense of that's its trajectory, so they're inseparable. So certain fertility techniques separate the unitive and the procreative elements, such as gift, gamete intrafallopian transfer. This separates the unitive and the procreative elements. Now, I don't know if you know much about this technique, but basically the the egg and the sperm are put into a tube, basically, but they're separated by an air bubble, and then sometimes this is called sift too, but usually sift has a slightly different meaning. But they're put into a syringe, and then it's injected into a woman's womb. And so they think, well, this is an alternative to in vitro fertilization because you're not producing these embryos. Yeah, but the problem is that you're separating the union, which is designed for the man to deposit semen in the woman's uterus in order for her to conceive. And so that union is ordered towards the conception to occur within the womb. That's what it's designed for. You know, if women could get pregnant by conceiving outside, there would be some natural mechanism by which, you know, guys would just kiss her and then she could take the kiss, and then that would be, you know, she'd be like a kangaroo, you know, the kiss could crawl into her pouch or something. You know, it'd be something analogous to that. But they're not like that. It's not designed that way. And so gift, by separating the unit of procreative elements, violates the finality of the generative faculties, and that means it's sinful, morally sinful, in fact. Why? Because of the nature of this union, it's grave, because you're producing something that's very serious, a human being, or it's ordered towards producing something very serious. And so any violations which break this process up, here by that I mean separate the unit of the procreative elements, is always gravely sinful. Then there is what's called sift. I feel kind of stupid. I'm sure you guys know more about this stuff than I do, but this is called semen intrafallopian transfer. And this is, if I remember correctly, it's basically the same process, except the stress is on the semen, which is different, of course, from artificial insemination. So artificial insemination is immoral because of the fact that it separates what? The sperm is gathered by non-union, usually, although sometimes they can gather it by the couple having conjugal relations and then they siphon off the semen and then they re-inject it. But that separates the union from the procreative elements, because you're basically this is not just a moral thing. The moral finalities in all of this are rooted in the very physical nature of the thing. So you look at the physical structure of it, and it tells you that contained in this physical structure are moral finalities. Its trajectory is to produce something moral. And so the physical structure of the thing has to be observed. Otherwise, you violate the moral finalities contained in it. And that seems a bit abstract, but that's basically what's going on. So artificial insemination, which of course is where they usually take the semen by a non-union, although so they can, and then they inject it into the woman's womb or whatever the case is in order to have her conceive. Apparently that's the big thing. The biggest pushers, by the way, of the new fertility techniques are lesbians, because you can have children without getting involved with men. And then of course it's wrong because it separates the union and the procreative elements, because you're basically procreating in a way without the union, because you've disrupted the union. The union's been physically separated from the actual conjugal, or from the actual procreation. But then of course there's different kinds of that, what they call homologous artificial insemination, and that's when the semen comes from your husband. The church says that's not as bad, but it's still morally sinful, because you're violating the inseparability of the unit of procreation. But then there's also heterologous, which is when women use other men's sperm other than their husband. The church says this isn't adultery as such, because there's no conjugal relations, but it's adulterous in character, because the nature of conjugal relations is to receive the woman to receive something into her from the man's substance, and that means that it's really only what her husband's entitled to that because of the bodily rights they exchanged at marriage. And so outside that context, it's adulterous in character, because she's receiving into her a substance that from another male that's not hers, that she's not entitled to. In vitro fertilization, putting aside the fact of they commit eugenics or they kill a large number of them, which is against the third category of natural inclination. It's contrary to the second category of natural inclination. Why? Because, again, you're separating the unitive and the procreative elements. The second category of natural inclination intended that people through a natural union would have children. That's what our inclination is. Then there's also a thing called ectogenesis. Now this one's getting to be a bit complicated because in my discussions with this, there's a gray area that nobody seems to really conclude on. Ectogenesis is basically gestation of the child outside the womb of the mother, coming from the Greek words ecto and genesis, which means to generate outside of. And this is contrary to the fact that the natural law intended that the child be gestated by his own mother. And so if it was possible for the parents to have union and then contraception and the conception even took place within the woman's womb, but then they were able to get, before nidation occurred, before the child implanted, they were able to get it and then gestate it outside the womb. It's contrary to the order of nature, so it's generally conceded as being morally sinful. But there is some discussion about whether this would be permissible for a sufficient reason. Now here we're talking about there would have to still be at least some implantation in the wall, and then after that, if the gestational process went south, that you'd use some type of ectogenesis, that is, some type of incubation or some type. And ectogenesis is where they can actually feed the child outside the womb until such a stage, it's the whole, was it 1984? Yeah, 1984 thing. But but the question becomes, okay, well, what about a woman who does something by in vitro? We know that's wrong, but then she's got all these kids she can't carry to term. Can we use them by ectogenesis? And that has gotten into quite a bit of a debate, because the question then becomes, is this permissible? My own inclination is to say no. But because nature did not intend for children to be normally gestated outside the womb. Now we do incubate kids, so I'm willing to concede that at a certain stage you could use ectogenesis post-implantation. But before then I think you got a problem. But again, that's an area that's open to debate. The church hasn't ruled on it yet. Also, then we have surrogacy. Now, there's a Vatican official who said, but it's not, it's not one of these official things. It's not like an encyclical or something. Who said that surrogacy is malum in se. That is, it's evil in its very nature. And the reason being is why? Well, the fact of the matter is that, again, we're back to the whole thing. Women are not kangaroos, despite what some people would like to make them out to be. They're not kangaroos. They're not designed to be able to gestate each other's different kids. So the nature of the woman's generative faculty is ordered towards union and gestating her own child. That's what the natural law is structured towards. And remember, this is an inseparable unitive thing. It's not ordered towards a woman gestating a child that's not her own. Now, because that's not what it's designed for. Aside from the fact that to use surrogacy, you have to use in vitro fertilization, or you have to have artificial insemination, or you just have to have adultery, and then it's not real surrogacy anyway. But it's not true surrogacy if it's artificial insemination, but you have to have in vitro fertilization, and then the child is planted in a woman who's not her mother. So it's possible, they say, for a child to have, well, now that they can take chromosomal structures and break them up and put them together, or at least that's what they're working on, it's possible to have at least 5 parents. Okay, the natural mother, that is the one for whom the gamete comes from, the ovum, the natural father, the gestational mother, the adoptive mother, and the adoptive father. Now, if they can start doing all the intertwining of the various chromosomal things, or the gene things, then eventually what's going to happen is you'll have all sorts of parents. So this is a monster. I mean, you're producing something in a way that nature had never intended. And God, we know what God intended, we know what His will is by looking at this, and so surrogacy is contrary to gestation. Now, that means it's contrary to the natural law. That is gestation done by the mother. It means it's contrary to the natural law. Some people come along and say, well, wait a minute, we've got all these kids being held in stasis and cryogenics. We like a bridge over troubled water. Okay. Now, I'm not sure why God allowed that particular tune to be said at this point, but the surrogacy, they say, well, wait a minute, we've got all these kids who are in stasis and cryogenics because we've got all these products of in vitro fertilization, we've got all these concepti, embryos, what are we going to do with them? So they say, but it would be just uncharitable to, let them all die. Well, wait a minute. Christ said, if you love me, that is, in order to fill the order of charity, you have to what? Keep my commandments. What are the commandments? The expression of the natural law. Charity can never violate the natural law. And for that reason alone, charitable surrogacy, that is, a woman who volunteers to carry a child to term who's not her own so the child doesn't die, is immoral. It's the ends justify the means problem. So then people ask, well, what do you do with these things? These people, actually. It's human beings. And I suggest, well, we have to accept the fact that the parents have put these children in extremis. By extremis is a pastoral theological term, which means they put them in the danger of death. Or the death is immediate, and so because of the nature of the situation. And so what I argue is you can't keep them in stasis because that's contrary to their rights as individuals to keep them in stasis without their volition. So what do? You thaw them out and baptize them if possible. I say if possible because I'm not exactly sure how that would be done. But you baptize them if possible, and then you have to let nature take its course. He says, well, you're killing them. No, you're not. You're letting nature take its course. It's analogous to letting somebody die. So the point is in all of this is that we've created this disastrous, and the surrogacy issue is heating up. And the real problem with this whole surrogacy debate is the people who are in favor of allowing it are not people who are following the natural law. When you start listening to their arguments, they never discuss the natural law. And that's a serious problem. Then, of course, there's cloning. And cloning is immoral, of course. Why? Because, again, the unitive is separated from the procreative. Now, here by cloning, we're talking about embryonic cloning. So it's a case of... and the other thing is, too, is nature never intended for a child not to have a father or a mother. And this is a case in which you would actually have that. There's also other new fertility techniques. They're now to the point where they can chemically manipulate and shock the ovum into just start reproducing on its own. So you don't even need a father anymore. Nature never intended that either. Again, it's separation of the unitive and procreative elements. But it's also it's contrary to the natural category of natural inclination. You just look at it and God had intended that people have a mother and a father, not 5 of each or whatever the case may be. All right. Or just one, for that matter. Okay, so these are the sins against the second category of natural inclination. Now we have to talk about the third category of natural inclination. Of course, the third category of natural inclination is that which is proper to reason. That which is the life proper to reason. Okay. Suicide is against the third category of natural inclination, and this also includes euthanasia on the side of the patient. So it's contrary to the category, the third, because why? It has to do with living in community. Suicide is taking of your life. Now, Plato says that we're not our own. And this is something that's quite important. I need to make a distinction to get into this in order to answer the suicide and also to answer the whole issue of women who think they have rights over their bodies. And that has to do with the fact that there are two kinds of rights. There are what we call absolute rights and conditional rights. There's only one person who has any absolute rights, it's God. Since God is the creator of everything that exists, other than himself, of course, because he exists on his own, everything that exists, he created, he keeps it in being, he supplies for it, he does everything for it, and therefore, God has absolute rights. Human beings, on the other hand, have no absolute rights. All our rights are conditional rights. Conditioned on what? The natural law. The natural law determines what the parameters are of our rights, and nobody has absolute rights. Since I did not create myself, I don't have control over my own being, and since it's contrary to the first category of natural inclination for me to take suicide, I don't have the right to take my life. I don't have the right to take my life because of the fact that it's contrary to living in community, because it affects other people around me when I commit suicide. Okay. When you're talking about a woman's right over her body, it's a conditional right, not an absolute right. And when you listen to people say, well, I have a right over my body, and there's a problem is it rings true in a certain sense. Yeah, I mean, people do kind of have a certain right over their, but it's a conditional right, not an absolute right. And that right is conditioned by the natural law. So once the child gets there, guess what? Natural law comes into a play, and you don't have control over it anymore. You might physically, because God might tolerate that, but not morally. So a woman's right over her body is a conditional right. And how do we know that? Well, even the government knows that. Like, for instance, the government knows that if a woman joins the military, she's got to go and do with her body what they tell her to do. Okay, go over there and stand in front of this cannon. You know, well, if she doesn't do it, guess what? They take her body and they put her in jail. So it doesn't matter what she does. She's going to have to get her body. She's not going to get to do what she wants with it. It's also the same thing with taxes, you know. If I always got to do whatever I wanted with my own body, well, then you couldn't keep me from killing people. The government couldn't demand any taxes because I could just say, no, I don't want to use my body to raise taxes, to generate revenue for the government. So the church, the state knows, at least implicitly, not explicitly, that we don't have absolute rights. These things are conditional, and they're conditional based upon what? The natural law. God's intention about what our rights are built into there. But on the other hand, if you violate somebody who has a legitimate natural law right, even though it's conditional, that's an injustice, and you have to pay the price for that. That's against the third category of natural inclination. Then there is mutilation. And this would include things like transgender operations. You know, when you see somebody walking down the street and you're not sure what the gender is, this is a problem. Because part of living in society is that the proper roles of the society are clearly delineated for the proper education of all. And so the actual transgender is contrary to living in societies. It's contrary to knowing the truth. It's a form of falsity. St. Thomas says that there's a lie, which is speaking the false, in order to deceive. But then he says there's also doing in order to deceive. And having a transgender operation is doing something in order to deceive people into thinking that you're a female when you're not. I only say that because for some reason or other, there seems to be more of a problem with men than women. I don't know. But anyway. But mutilation is contrary to the virtue of truthfulness. You have to look your age. Sorry, no plastic surgery without a sufficient reason. And you have to look at your own gender. It's also contrary to truthfulness in the sense of like breast augmentations without a sufficient reason, that is, putting aside mastectomies. You're talking about a case in which, look, these aren't real, so they're not true. So it's a form of falsity, it's a form of deception. Contraception and sterilization. Are against the third category of natural inclination. Why? Because having children produces citizens in a society which affects the common life. The fact that we wipe out every year the total amount that is almost the population of Denver, Colorado every year, you can't tell me it's not affecting the common good. The fact that we've wiped out, over 40 million children, maybe even 50 million children in this, since abortion's been allowed in this country legally, you can't tell me that's not affecting the common good. We've wiped out worldwide over 1 billion people in the last 40 years, 50 years alone. You can't tell me that's not affecting the common good. So the fact of the matter is that these things actually are contrary to the third category of natural inclination. They're affecting society. They're also that's with abortion. I should say that's with abortion. But even contraception blocks the number of people that people end up having. I mean, let's face it, the fact that some people aren't having kids is affecting what? The amount of taxes, and so I have to pay more taxes. I mean, if you want to put it down at such a profane level. And it's also affecting the common good in the sense that, you know, they're not having children who could be contributing to the common good. That's why I said the state has a right to limit contraception and sterilization. Abortion, again, it's contrary to living in society. It's contrary to justice, which is part of living in common. It's contrary to justice because why? Once this kid exists, he's in the society because he has a relationship with the people who brought him into being, who are living within the society, so he lives within the society. And so it's contrary to the virtue of justice. It's contrary to the common good to go around killing the innocent. The only time killing a person is a penal act. That's what St. Thomas says. It's an act by which you punish somebody. Now, St. Thomas says that means that by its nature you have to have what's called a justifying condition. St. Thomas says, you know, just the notion of killing a man, that's the natural species, just killing somebody. There's some kind of disordered about it. But he says, but sometimes, given the conditions, there's a justifying condition which drains out that disorder and actually rightly orders it to the good of the society and the good of the individual and everybody else. There's an article called by Stephen Long on Evangelium Vitae and Capital Punishment. It's in the Thomas. It's the best article I've read on a thing anywhere because it really deals with the issues. You know, capital punishment is not just a matter of protecting society. We have to get that through our heads. But the point being is this. You have to have a justifying condition to be killing somebody because killing somebody is penal. So that means if the person's guilty of a capital crime, it can be licitly employed. If somebody's a combatant in a war, that's legitimate because you actually should be punishing your enemies for doing this. But a person's suffering doesn't fit the penality of it. In other words, they have to have something for which they're guilty so that you can punish them by the killing of them. Suffering isn't it, so mercy killing's out based on those principles. And it also means killing the innocent is out because they're not guilty of the capital crime. So you can't kill the innocent directly. We can do it indirectly. We'll talk a little bit about that when we get to, because in abortion, you can take someone's life indirectly. Because there's a difference between direct and indirect abortion. Direct is when I go in and I just suck the kid out, or I stab it, you know, in the heart and then drag all the parts out, or whatever the case is. Whereas indirect is you take a part of the mother out and indirectly the child dies as a result of it. This is a different thing on a moral level because you're doing what? You're healing the mother. Indirectly the child lies. In this case, you're not healing the mother, you're just killing the kid. So, you can allow indirect abortions if there's a proportionate what? If there's a sufficient reason, that is, the mother's going to die, which means die. So you can indirectly take the life of the child. But again, you have to have a justifying condition to kill somebody. And abortion lacks the justifying condition. Also, we're not the author of life. It's contrary to the third category of natural inclination in knowing God. In knowing God, we have a natural inclination. We should know God. We should come to knowledge about who He is and what His rights are, and that means it's contrary to God as the author of our life, and therefore abortion is contrary to that. The next is embryonic stem cell research. Actually, I'm just going to put embryonic research. The stem cell research would fall under that. With the case of embryonic stem cell research, you're killing children, so it's contrary to justice. Because by creating a conceptus and then taking out the genetic material and putting other genetic material back in and refusing or whatever, it's analogous to taking somebody and pulling all their guts out of them and then putting someone else's guts in them. I mean, that's analogous what it's to. Do you remember when I said that with abortion, we also know that it's murder, right? But why do we know it's murder? Well, because it's a human person. But we need to make sure we really know what this means. Remember when I said it starts with union? and then it goes, and then there's procreation. But when you look at the procreation part of it and the conceiving part of it, once the child is conceived, there is a single solitary trajectory towards producing a human adult. And we know it's a single solitary trajectory because the genetic material doesn't change. We can watch its progression. It's heading towards this direction. So that in point in fact, there is this human adult, that is the final trajectory of this thing, indicates that what? The augmentative faculty, remember that's one of growth, is the same from the beginning to the end. Right, because there's no substantial change. It's not like the thing is a cat and then it turns into a human being. It starts out as a conceptus. The minute that happens, there's a natural set of trajectory. It starts augmentating, starts growing, and gets to the point where it's a human adult. And that's a single process heading towards that one direction. Even though there's other things that come into play, it has to implant the uterine wall, get nutrients from its mother, and has to be fed. But that point is that this augmentative faculty is one, because the child is from the conceived to human adult. It's one single solitary trajectory. Anytime a single faculty of the soul is present, the soul is present. Why? Because the faculties can't exist without the soul. You know, it's not like, say, hey, there goes some guy's intellect down the way. You just don't do that. Or, you know, did you see that faculty of speech going by? You know, it's not that type of thing. They don't exist on their own. They always exist in some human being. And so the human being is what? A composite of body and soul. So the soul is present anytime a human faculty is operative. So in this case, we know for a fact that what? It's the same augmentative faculty, because it begins here and it develops it with the same single solitary trajectory to a human adult. This unitary aspect of the augmentative faculty is why we know it's a human. It's human at the beginning, because why? The faculty, the augmentative faculty of the soul is present. So the soul is present at the beginning. Then, of course, once it implants, then the nutritive faculty begins its process. But the nutritive faculty doesn't really, you can't really see its activities until there's implantation in the woman's womb. But the augmentative faculty is clear from the beginning. So this is how we know that it's a human being, and that's why abortion is an injustice. It's still against the category of natural inclination, or the second category of natural inclination, if you put this consideration aside. But in reality, it's one of the most important things because of the fact that you're killing somebody who's a human being. Therefore, embryonic stem cell research, because it's a human being at this, it's immoral. It's a form of murder. This also includes, now they're talking about, we'll be able to take adult stem cells and mix them now with embryonic stem cells, and that'll solve the problem. No, it doesn't. You're still getting it from the wrong place, from the wrong source. Then, embryonic stem cell research, once the child has been killed, this is another thing. Once the child has been killed, by that, the injustice continues against God, because there's two orders of justice. The natural order, that's between you and me, and the transcendent order, between us and God. So if I kill you, I not only violate your rights, but I violate God's rights over you. And so I violate the both orders. So what happens? When I kill somebody, I can't restore the natural order of justice because the guy's not here anymore. So what do I have to do? I have to fulfill the transcendent order of justice. And how do you do that? You return the remains of the child back to God. And how's that done? By burial. So anytime you have a case of children who have been aborted, or these other things, or there's embryonic stem cell research is done, or they've killed embryos, the only just way to deal with that is to return it back to God. Also, vaccinations derived from fetal tissues. Vaccinations that are derived from fetal tissues. I'm not going to get into all the science of it. You should probably know it by now. If you don't, you can look it up. But the vaccinations derives by fetal tissue. This fetal tissue, which is the thing that's used, the instrument that's used in order to, this is the circumstance of by what age. In other words, you might be vaccinating somebody. That's the moral act, vaccinating, which is, in a certain sense, morally good to vaccinate people, provided there's a sufficient reason. But then, I mean, obviously you wouldn't go around vaccinating Adam and Eve, so there wouldn't be a need for it. But there might be a legitimate need, like there's an outbreak in some place or whatever, and your intention might be for the person's health, so that's good, but you're using an aid which is immoral. The fetal tissue, once you've taken this and then you derive the vaccine from the fetal tissue, that vaccine is derived in a means that's immoral. So you have to do what? You can't use those vaccinations because they're immoral. Now, of course, some of these vaccinations, there's other vaccinations for most of them that you can get by other means. But what do you have to do with this? All the fetal tissue that's being used for the vaccinations, and even the vaccinations because they're derived from it, there's a very technical moral principle which I don't want to get into, but the fruits that are derived from that are also have to be returned. All that has to be returned to God. So what do you have to do? All the vaccination materials and all the fetal tissue has to be properly buried in order to return it back to God. That's because that's the only way we can get it back to Him. Embryonic, in vitro. Wait a minute, let me just make sure I got everything. Yeah, in vitro fertilization is also against the third category of natural inclination. Why? Because every child has a right to be conceived in the normal manner. And why is that? Because the nature of the natural law is designed that children should be conceived in this way, and so the child has a right to be conceived in this way. So it's contrary to the rights of the child to be conceived within a woman and within marriage, outside of a woman and outside of marriage, or even inside of marriage. And this is also against the unitive and the procreative dimension, of course. So it's contrary to the rights of the child. Embryonic and fetal experimentation. This, remember when I said that we have conditional rights over our body? Well, fetal experimentation is contrary to justice because the experimentation must always be gained volitionally from somebody. Parents can supply the volition only when it is specifically ordered to the child's health, which is in the charge of the parents. In other words, the parents are the child is given to the parents for them to take care of it, to maintain its health, to make sure that it's properly educated, etc. Anything aside from that, they have to say no. So what does this mean? It means that you cannot experiment on fetal tissue or on fetuses or embryos because they cannot give consent. This includes genetic enhancing and genetic manipulation outside the intention of nature. And what's this mean? Well, nature had the idea that there'd be certain limits. I mean, human beings would be structured in certain ways, so there's certain limits. So to try and manipulate human beings so they go beyond those limits is contrary to the order of nature, it's contrary to the intention of God. So you shouldn't be doing that because nature didn't intend it. But you can, provided there is no other means, and if it's just purely experimental and there's no other possible means, and there could be some hope of success, the parents could consent to the genetic manipulation of the embryo that's already been implanted, and there's no danger of it losing its life if it has some grave genetic defect. Not just because you want blue eyes rather than red eyes, rather than green eyes. You actually have to have a serious reason. So you could do the genetic manipulation with a sufficient reason, and if all other means are exhausted, the parents could provide it. But you couldn't do the experimentation for pure experimentation's sake. This may not have any effect, we just want to see what the effects are going to be. You can do that with adults if they give consent, if it's reasonable that this was going to contribute somehow to science. But outside that context, the parents can only give consent if it's ordered towards the actual health of the child. That means there has to be some reasonable hope of success. This is also against cloning. It's against the third category of natural inclination. My chalkboard's getting full here. society is founded upon a variety of individuals and their individual perfections. And so as a result, it's contrary to what? Living in common. God wanted a variety of different races, a variety of two different genders, not a variety, two different genders. He wanted a variety of different accents. He wanted people with different skin colors, with different facial colors, with different attributes, different moral excellences and things like this for a reason. And cloning militates against that diversity, which we see naturally comes along when different people have children. But it's also against the rights of the child to be conceived of and born in the normal fashion. Surrogacy is contrary to the rights of the child to be born to married parents. In other words, he has a right to be born by his genetic mother. Actually, I should state that, by his mother, because there's some anomaly where there's some kids that don't seem to have too much genetic connection to their mother. But there still comes from their mother. That was something somebody indicated to me, some strange, apparently there's like 1 in 10,000 or 1 in 10 million or something like that. Also, charitable intentions do not supplant the natural law. And the divine positive law, that is, of which charity is a part, can never be contrary to the natural law since they proceed from the same author, that is, God. It is also contrary to the third category of natural inclination to keep embryos in stasis, either by cryogenics or otherwise. The Church says that a woman has an obligation, if she conceives a bunch of these children ex utero, or in vitro, she has an obligation to try and carry every single one of them to term. Now, I realize that sometimes they create like 32 of these things. Well, then she's got to try and carry them all to term. And if she can only carry a certain number of children, then she has to try and carry the ones that have the most likely chance of survival, probably, with the natural law inclination. Because you have to try and save as many as you possibly can. She has an obligation to do that. And when you tell women that, yeah, you've got 10 kids now, and you've got to try and carry them all to term, they get a little panicky. Again, you can't use charitable surrogacy because it's contrary to the natural law. And you can't keep them in stasis because it's contrary to their rights to keep them in stasis. It's analogous to if you were just standing on the side of the street and they grabbed you and threw you in a freezer, then froze you and then said, well, we'll thaw them out later. It can't work that way. Organ donation. Certain kinds of organ donation are contrary to the third category of natural inclination. That is, taking organs when the person is not truly dead. Oh, by the way, euthanasia is against the third category of natural inclination of justice, because you don't have a justifying condition to take the person's life, as I mentioned. Okay. But in organ donation, or taking the organs when the person is not truly dead. Now, I'm not sure how many of you know this. Maybe you do, because some of you are Catholic doctors. But the definition of brain death, which was given by Harvard, was a contrivance. They started doing heart transplants, and someone pulled them aside and said, this is in the 60s. You do realize that according to the current definition of death in the law system, you're committing murder and you could go to jail for this. So what did they do? They contrived the notion of brain death. But also, remember when I said that as long as a single faculty of the soul is present, the soul is present? Well, guess what? In order to take non-twinnable, or to take, there's certain organs they can't take from you, I'm sure you know, they can't take from you unless you're alive. So what does this mean? As long as, because we were talking about this in relationship to the human adult, as long as a single faculty of the soul is present, well, guess what? The nutritive faculty is present as long as there's breathing, as long as there is ingestion of any foods or anything like that, the nutritive faculty is present. And as a result, when they basically kill people to take organs, they're still alive because the soul is still present. It doesn't matter if the brain isn't functioning, because why? The death of a single, or the inactivity of a single faculty doesn't constitute the loss of the whole soul. No, the soul is present as long as there's a single faculty that can operate through it. So if the nutritive faculty is present, so if there's cardiopulmonary activity, that's it. the guy is still alive. And this means that at a minimum, he should be alive. At a minimum, the quaternary pulmonary activity should cease for at least 5 to 7 minutes. At least. Normally, if you really want to be safe in these matters, it has to be an hour. Why? Because we can anoint somebody conditionally up to an hour because we don't know exactly when the soul departs. Now we do know that the soul, remember when I was saying the soul operates through the body, so as long as the form or the body is disposed, the form continues operating through it? Well, as soon as the body ceases being able to carry out the activities of the soul departs. And so as a result, as long as there is any activities in the body that are proper to the human faculties, that is nutrition, which include cardiopulmonary activity, the person's alive. And so to take their organs while they're still alive is murder. And that's why you can't do it. That's why brain death does not suffice. There's also certain kinds of organ donation that are contrary to the common good or the public living. Let me give you an example. Recently, they're talking about transplanting faces off of people. Now, the problem with this is that basically what it comes down to is this. There are certain organs into the human being that are really particular to the individual and really are the individual's own, and you shouldn't be playing around with them. His face is one of them. I mean, that's one of the principal things that distinguishes people is their face. So it would be a little strange to say, hey, there goes Joe's face on that guy down the street. I mean, there's just something not quite right about that. It's another matter if you're talking about, the person dies and they can take, say, the corneas. I don't know if the corneas can take after the person is really dead. Which incidentally, of course, there's 400 or more of us. I'm one of the 400, one of the more insignificant actually, but of the 400 people who have petitioned the Holy See to rule on brain death. And because of the fact that it's a contrivance. The whole definition of brain death done by the law system is a contrivance. And every year they're chipping away at it so that eventually they can. One of the proposals now is you can take the organs of somebody whose death is imminent. Well, then I asked this doctor who was telling me this, I said, well, what's the definition of imminent medically? He says a year. I'm like, well, okay. He says, so basically they could be taking my organs, he said, because he was a little bit older, but anyway. So things like the face are forbidden. You can't do that. Generative faculty, the parts of the generative faculty you can't, because those are proper to the individual. So there's certain organs that should not be transplanted, period. Now, if it's possible for them to just die and then there's some way for them to regenerate the organs, then they could do that, not with those things that are proper to the individual, but those organs that aren't. You can give organ donation of those which are twinnable, as I mentioned, such as the liver, provided there's a proportionate reason, and not just money. And also that there is, or twinned organs. So those can be taken with a sufficient reason. They can be donated. But you can't take them from somebody without their consent. That's another problem with a lot of this organ donation. The guy's dead, or not dead, he's sitting on the machines. He's on a vent, and then they come in and they say, well, they'll go to the parents or whoever happens to be the next of kin. They have it's all the machinery now. They actually have a federal team. They have to, I've been told, people at the hospitals have to notify the federal government or whoever is in charge of this thing so that they can send a team over to pressure the people to give them the organs. Well, what they really want though is they want these things because the person isn't dead yet, of course, so they need to get these things before they're dead. And they'll take them from the person without his consent. If he's still alive, then the next of kin can allow experimentation for his benefit. That is, provided, again, it's the same thing with I mentioned with the embryos. If there's a sufficient, if it's clear that this is going to at least nominally have a hope of success, they can allow the experimentation. But if you're talking about just pure experimentation where there's no indication there's going to be any success, although it would help us to understand these things more, that can be tolerated if someone can give their consent and there's no other means possible. But when you're talking about those things which are, it's not ordered towards a person's health, the next of kin can't give consent to that unless if there's no means of hope of helping the individual. Okay. Euthanasia, which is murder. As I mentioned, suffering is not a sufficient reason to kill someone. Finally, the removal of ordinary means, and then we'll try and get to the stuff that's listed. I'll go quickly through that. Ordinary means is always, food and water is always ordinary means, and it always has to be supplied, save one caveat. I've been talking to a number of theologians, and we all agree that ordinary means is analogous to eating. I mean, if you go a day without eating, it's not a big deal. So our general consensus is that they can withhold the food and hydration for up to 24 hours, if necessary. If there's some indication that it would slow the process of the problem. Or there was a case of a child there was a guy who was 17 years old, he had a brain aneurysm and they didn't know it, they got him into the hospital, and so they put him on IV. And they noticed every time they started pumping fluids in him, his health just went, because his aneurysm was just bulging out, and he was basically bleeding internally from it worse. So in that case, I would say, wait a minute, you don't have to put somebody on ordinary means for 24 hours, because the body's designed for that. But after 24 hours, you have to put them on it. You can take them off of the ordinary means if death is certain within 24 hours. Otherwise, the ordinary means must always be supplied, and food and hydration must always be supplied. The Holy Father, John Paul II, came out and said that shortly before he died, that ordinary means is always necessary. And of course, some people panic. I'm like, well, that's what the theologians have been saying forever. But extraordinary means, you cannot remove ordinary means outside those conditions. Also, you have to be careful with living wills. Living wills can violate the natural law if they direct people to kill them or things like that. Whereas living wills, I usually tell people don't get a living will because it's a legal nightmare. Get a power of attorney who knows what they're doing, and tell them exactly what the things you want, and then you can go from there. All right. The things that are allowed. So we've talked about, you can't do this, you can't do that, but what about the things that are allowed? And that's something which I'll try and get through quickly because I know this is kind of going on and people are thinking, I need to go to the restroom. All right. Surgeries which are done for a sufficient reason, such as to restore the order of nature, for example, in burn victims or mastectomies, things like that. And technically speaking, again, this is an act of restoring the order of nature, not mutilation. Licit operations are governed by the principle of totality. So if you have to take it out to save the person's whole, or the lesser of two evils. Well, we could do this, but the guy's just going to be gravely afflicted the rest of his life with it. And the principle of double effect. So if there's a good effect that could come from it, but there's a bad effect and there's a proportion between those two, that would suffice. You can use medicines that may have a contraceptive effect, provided certain conditions. That is, there's a necessity for it. Licit use of medicines which are contraceptive may be used based upon the principles of double effect. So, okay, the contraceptive effect, but that means because contraceptive effect is grave, you have to have a grave reason to be putting them on a medication that is contraceptive. Or even the lesser of two evils. Being on a contraceptive, having something that's a medicine that's have a contraceptive effect isn't as bad as bleeding to death, or isn't as bad as whatever the case may be. But you have to it has to be the lesser of two evils. Double effect, again, demands it be proportionate. Therefore, one should not prescribe the pill, for example, just to solve a problem with a woman's menstruation. There should be proper testing to ensure what the real source of the problem is, and if it can't be ascertained, then you can put them on. But otherwise, you should first, unless you have to do it initially to keep her from hemorrhaging or something like that, but you can do it initially, but you've got to get to the root of the problem. As soon as you find out, you've got to get her off and get her on the stuff that's actually going to solve her problem. Surgeries which have a sterilizing effect may be done, but they can only be done to justify the principle of totality. That is, if they need to survive. The lesser of two evils, and the principle of double effect. So, as I mentioned, ectopic pregnancies You can do that. It has ectopic pregnancies can have a sterilizing effect on a woman, not entirely in some cases, but it can have a sterilizing effect on someone. So as a result, you can do it only if there's a proportion. You can do it because you're saving the life of the mother. So the life of the mother is more important than the fact that she can actually bear children. There are certain fertility techniques that are permitted. One that's called L-tote. Another one that's called tote. L-tote is low tube ovum transfer, and that's happened is when a woman ovulates. You take the ovum and the physician moves it down into the ovum and down into the fallopian tube farther, so that there's better chance of conception. Although L-tote, they begin to realize, doesn't have much success because conception occurs, but then the child gets expelled before it can actually implant. So a lot of them went to just L-tote, where they move it down, but not all the way down into the fallopian tube. They move it down just a little bit farther. These are permissible because one is in fact aiding nature in fulfilling what it's striving for. So you can aid nature, but you can't act contrary to it. You can use hormonal therapy provided that it is necessary, and the hormonal therapy should be proportionate to the woman's needs. So you can't just, okay, this medication will help them, so I'll give them 5 times the amount they need so I can just get them out of my hair and get this done with. No, it has to be proportionate. Adult stem cell research is permitted because there's no death of the individual, and it actually contributes to the good of the scientific endeavor of helping people save their lives. This includes adult stem cells, umbilical cords, and things of this sort. Because again, they're with incongruity of the natural law. They're helping nature achieve its end, not acting contrary to nature. Organ donation of twinned or twinnable organs while alive, and other usable organs, which are not many of them, once truly dead, does not include generative organs, as I said, the brain or those things which are proper to the individual. So, by the way, you can't have brain transplants either. 7, although I'm sure some people would benefit from it. 7, giving someone drugs with the intention to ease pain. So, for instance, if someone is suffering tremendously, you can give them morphine, and even though you know it's going to hasten the death, provided it's a principle of double effect. That's the bad effect. It might hasten death, but presuming that's aside from your intention, and you give them just the amount of medication that's necessary, so we're talking about something that's proportionate, then it's okay. Now, most people don't, well, you guys know this, euthanasia is occurring all the time in hospitals. They just overdose people with morphine. It looks so natural to people. Oh, he just fell asleep and went to pee naturally. It just looks normal. Well, the fact of the matter is that you can't overdose them. In other words, it has to be a proportionate amount. And that's based upon the principle of double effect. So you can ease their pain. But you can't snuff people that way. The removal of extraordinary means. Now, something is extraordinary means, and we're almost done, so. Extraordinary means is based on 3 things. First, let it be said that no one is required to employ extraordinary means, and that is a procedure or treatment which becomes extraordinary means when any one of the following apply. So if something becomes extraordinary once any of these apply. First is that the treatment's not available. I don't have to fly all the way across the planet and go running around looking for something in order to make use of it. But if it's right there, it's another matter. 2, the treatment is non-therapeutic. It's not helping me out. I can't spell today. That's it. It's non-therapeutic. And this is sometimes where it gets a bit difficult. A treatment is non-therapeutic when it is reasonably judged that it will not better the person's condition or cure them of the illness. So it's when it's a reasonable judgment. You just have to look at it, make the best judgment call you can that it's not going to better the person's condition or cure them of their illness. 3, the treatment will cause undue psychological or financial burden. to the patient or the next of kin. I don't have to, a husband doesn't have to bankrupt the family out in order to try something, and then it doesn't work, and then there you have it. If any one of these is in play, it's extraordinary means. That means it doesn't have to be tried at first. You don't even have to try it. Or second, once it's started, you do not have to continue it. Even though you have to always continue the ordinary means, you don't have to continue it. And that is exceptionally reasonable. Most people have this idea, the Catholics are just horrible, no, they're not. It's very reasonable. If the thing's good, you don't have to, you're mercy killing. No, it's a different thing. We're not killing the person. In this case, with the extraordinary means, when we take them off the extraordinary means, because remember, they're not helping the person, then what happens? Then you take the person off the extraordinary means, and then nature takes its course. It's not like, pumping them full of morphine in order to wipe them out. One may use drugs or other forms of treatment to make the patient comfortable or to relieve pain, including drugs which hasten death, as long as the intention not to hasten the death is, in other words, you don't have the intention to hasten the death, but to relieve the patient's pain or discomfort. That has to be your intention. B, the intention is not to take the life of the patient, so it's there to relieve the pain. For example, morphine may be used to relieve a patient's pain, even though in large quantities, which may be necessary to relieve the pain, it may bring the death about a little sooner. But the morphine, you can't overdose the person. You just have to use it just enough to achieve the end. You can't, give them 5 times more than is necessary. Even if extraordinary means have begun to be used, as I mentioned, their use may be discontinued as long as one of the above criteria applies. This would mean, for example, if one is put on a vent or respiratory, but was in fact clearly not benefiting from any treatment that you're giving him, the vent could be removed, but you would still have to feed him nutrition and hydration. So, and even if that means that it's going to take, if you take them off the vent, they're going to die, that's fine. Again, if all the reasonable means have been taken and they're just not getting any better, you don't have to continue something. Okay. The only thing I would also say about using a living will or a power of attorney, make sure that that person knows the natural law and knows what the teachings of the church are, so that you don't become the end of getting snuffed. All right. We'll stop there. Why don't we take about a 5-minute break?
I have a quick question.
Okay, yeah. And then,
immunizations.
Yeah.
Many thousands of Catholics throughout the country go to their doctor. The doctor gives them MMR and or one of the other ones.
Right.
And it's a constant issue as to which ones are and which ones aren't.
Yeah, what's the name of the woman that's got the...
COG, Children of God.
Yeah, you go to Children of God.
Those people are very good.
Yeah, she spent a lot of time tracking that down.
The changing...
Yeah.
How much effort does the common Catholic have to put into tracking this and ensuring that they're not... And what if they are given an immunization that is from...
Well, if they're given one aside from their knowledge, they don't know, then they're not culpable for it. I mean, objectively, God's still offended, but they're not culpable for it. So what they do is all you do is, basically, as long as you're not volitionally involved in it, in the sense of you didn't know that was going on, then you're just not responsible for it. And what you might do is, as an act of reparation to God, even though you may not be culpable for it, is just pray that ask Him to help some other soul that they wouldn't fall into this. As far as the reasonable means, I think that I think you should have to do some type of reasonable investigation on the web. I mean, going to Children of God, usually you can track that down because that stuff is pretty much up. That stuff's really up to date. At least the stuff I've seen. I could be wrong on that, but. The other problem that you really have is that people are not even aware of the fact that this is a problem. Recently, the Vatican put out a thing about this, about immunizations, and there's a big problem with the document. I mean, yeah, it says, no, you're not supposed to do it, but then they say, but in a case of emergency, you could do it. But wait a minute, the ends don't justify the means. I was talking to Father Wolf about this. In my initial reading of the document, although I've got to go through it with a fine-tooth comb, they didn't really address the issue of why it's wrong. It's wrong because you're making illicit use of a child's remains. And that's why that was taken from him unjustly. Now, it's possible for parents, I mean, I don't think it can be, maybe it can be done, I don't know, but maybe it can be done in certain circumstances. If a child is stillborn, because the his body has been consigned to the parents, they could allow the child's body to be used, not for experimentation while it's alive, but once it's dead, they could give the body up for experimental use, provided that they make sure that it's treated reverently, and it could be used to devise the vaccines. That would be illicit use. The problem is they've aborted these kids, and so their possession of these kids' bodies is illicit, and then they make use of that, and that's where the real problem lies. So a lot of people that just are completely unaware of how these vaccines are made, and that's where the real problem is. I mean, when you start telling people that, and of course, some of the bishops are knowledgeable about this, but this is a can of worms. I mean, if they're just like, I don't want to go there, because what's going to happen as soon as the Catholic Church comes out against certain vaccinations? See, the Catholic Church is still medieval. They're stuck back there. They don't seem to understand. But that's not the case. So I think a person has to take reasonable means. St. Thomas says that we have an obligation to know the natural law, even if and we have to take reasonable means to know it. So he says, like, for instance, a person who commits fornication and doesn't take a reasonable means to know the natural law, he's still culpable for the fornication. Because why? Because he didn't take reasonable means to know any better. If he would have taken all the reasonable means and he still didn't know and he went ahead with it, then that's one matter. And I think that's where a lot of people are. I don't think most people take any type of reasonable means. I think most people don't know where these things are coming from. I think that's the real problem. Yeah.
The second natural law, or however you define it,
Okay.
how do you fit natural family planning into that, especially looking to check the cervical needs and so forth?
Yeah, in that case, what it is the unitive and the procreative elements are not being divided because you're actually working within nature. Because nature did not intend for a woman to be fertile 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Although some women say they are that way because every time their husband just looks at them, they're pregnant. But the point is that nature had intended a specific kind of a structure to her fertility. And so you can work within the structure of that fertility provided you have a sufficient reason to do so. Now, I just wrote an article that's going to really get I'll deal with that in a minute, but the sufficient reason, Pius XII says, has to be a grave reason. You have to have a grave reason to forego having children. And by grave, he says something that's economic, like you're going to starve to death, or you can hardly provide for the kids that you have. Or he says sociological, like in China, if you know, they already tracked your wife down, and if she gets pregnant and then they're going to force an abortion on her, well, then you could use it in that case. So you have to have a sufficient reason, but it works, it's based upon the order of nature. You're not blocking you're not separating the unit of the procreative, you're not blocking anything, and so it works within accord. But you have to have a sufficient reason to make use of it. So they always say that the use of natural family planning is illicit means. But remember, you have to have the object and circumstances. The end can't be contraceptive. People can't just say, well, I'll use this because we're going to use it the same way we would contraceptive. That's still illicit means. You can have the intentional, and we can have children now, but it has to be for a more remote end that is legitimate, because if we do, we'll have these kinds of problems in our family or whatever, serious problems in the family. So the end has to be ordered. The means is okay. It's natural family planning. Its very nature is okay because it works according to the order of the generative faculty and how it was designed. But the circumstances also have to be right. So you have to have due circumstances. So the sociological things would be a case of the circumstances. If they were grave, you could make use of it, and that type of thing. So it works according to the order of nature because it doesn't block the unit. It doesn't separate the unitive and procreative, because of the fact that it's still designed. And that's usually what the church says. Now, I did write an article which is going to get the hackles of people up, but in fact, I wanted to put it under a pseudonym, but the publisher said no. This is going to generate mail, so you got to put your name on it. But basically, what I did was I said, the teaching of NFP as to the anatomical details should not be taught in mixed companies for people who are about to get married. Think about it. You've got people who are they're in mixed company, so there's all these other good-looking men and women in the same room, and you're at a time when hormonal levels seem to be rather high. People are struggling to remain chaste, and then you start talking about vaginal mucus. You're out of your mind. You're talking about a case of putting people in the occasion of sin. So I tell people, look it. What it comes down to is there are certain conditions would have to be met so that modesty is met in teaching this. I don't care if they want to teach the philosophical and the theological dimensions like we have, that this is legitimate. Fine, I don't care. That's good, in fact, in some cases, because it tells people, look, there's this alternative if you have a legitimate reason for it. But what I'm concerned about is the fact that it really should only be taught to, married couples with a clinician after they really have a need for it. Why they have to teach it to everybody is a bit mystifying to me, because not everybody's going to have a need for it. So what they should do is, as to the anatomical details of the whole process. So my theory is that should be held off until they're married and can be done according. I could see maybe teaching it in a class of women together of the same gender or men of the same gender, or whatever the case is, after they're married, so that there's a proper ordering of their thought and all that. But you don't do it to people who are struggling to be chaste to begin with. Although people will say, well, usually most of these people are living together anyway. And I'm like, well, yeah, but then you all you're doing is giving them ideas, so just, stop it. But anyway, does that make sense? I mean, it works within the order of nature because you're not separating the unitive and the procreative. Even though you're not going to be able to have children, you yourself are not entering in, doing something which makes the body not possible to have the conception. It's already at a stage where it can't do that, so there's nothing wrong with, because why? Because and then if you, and this is something you get sometimes from people, they'll say, well, then you can only have conjugal relations at those times when she's fertile. No, that's not what nature intended. And remember, the church says you have to render any reasonable request. So it didn't say when she's fertile, it just says any reasonable request. So the church understands that there are times God built this into the nature. God knew that people wouldn't be, women wouldn't be fertile all the time, so that every time they just looked at each other, as I mentioned, the woman was pregnant. God didn't intend that, but at the same time, He didn't intend people to violate the natural order which He did establish. So you can work with it, but not contrary to it. So, okay. Any other questions? I guess we can just go, yeah.
Change subjects.
Sure.
It's a fairly common phenomenon to get somebody come in with a massive stroke, and you really don't think they're going to survive, so you do not, you consciously, this is a two-part question, you consciously at first decide you're not going to do anything extraordinary.
Right.
But I don't know whether you're going to live 24 hours or 7 days.
If there's question, again, putting aside the fact that sometimes putting someone on hydration in very rare circumstances could exacerbate the problem. Putting that issue aside, then normally you start those food and hydration immediately or within 24 hours.
Well,
So,
I would argue with food, because if somebody's had surgery, they may not be fed.
well,
3 days
I should
nutrition is-
by food. When I say hydration and nutrition, you can feed it either intravenously or by gastrotube or by normal eating. Any way that you can get. So if it's the type of thing that if they just can't take it down, like if they've been in surgeries, you can just feed it to them intravenously. That
But
suffices.
we don't feed, we hydrate intravenously post-surgery, but lots of times we wait 3 days before we start IV food supplements.
Well-
Because the person has that much reserve.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Before you start lipids and things like that.
Yeah.
Through the central veins, you may wait 3 days. So.
Yeah. So well, this is why I said there's a discussion about exactly when you have to start this stuff, and I just pinned 24 hours down only because I was thinking in terms of most people can go 24 hours without eating. So if the medical indication is such that hydration, you need to start them on earlier. But if it's the type of thing that they can forego a little bit, I don't have a problem. As long as the intention is not to worsen their condition, or if it's not going to worsen their condition without a sufficient reason. Yeah.
So do you consider administration of oxygen in your food and hydration requirements for the
It's actually, no, it's not. Now, I know that there's a book by the name of Brian Close. It's called The Facts of Life, and in there I think it's in the second edition, maybe it's in the first two, he says that oxygenation is an ordinary means. No, it's not actually, and this is the reason why. The human body is designed as such to take care of the oxygen thing normally on its own. Whereas so when a child comes out of the womb, once it starts breathing, it just kind of takes care of that function on its own. So it's naturally designed for that. But that's not the case with food and hydration. You got to feed the thing, but you don't have to breathe for it. Well, it's the same. So my argument is that means that's the dividing line. If nature can on its own just take care of this, then it becomes extraordinary means if the nature, if you have to add something to it. But if it's the type of thing that nature requires something above and beyond just its normal function it can do on its own, then it becomes ordinary means. So the food and hydration, the nutrition and hydration are ordinary means, but I don't think that the vent is. I don't think that putting them on a respirator is necessary. Because I think nature normally takes care of that type of thing on its own.
I didn't mean a respirator, I mean just kind of on the nose. I'm thinking of adults, not the kids.
Yeah, actually, sorry, because I transposed that to the actual realm of the discussion. I would consider that probably just another extraordinary means. Nature does not necessarily, it's not like you realize that over by this volcano there's more oxygen, so I got to run my kid over by this volcano. So in other words, I would say, no, it's not. I would consider it extraordinary means. It may be palliative. If people may get a certain relief from certain symptoms or something, or they may find it, I kind of like this. When I had my nose roto-rooted, they put me in one of those little lampshade things, like a little dog, and they feed you oxygen. I felt like one of those dogs that, they chase his tail around, but you're like, wow, this is kind of nice. But the thing is that, so if it has some type of relief to people, that's fine, but it's not required. Because nature intends for you to be able to survive on the natural oxygen level that's in the atmosphere. Yeah. But if it's that, here we're talking about something that's non-therapeutic. Obviously, if it's going to help the person and make them better, you don't say, well, sorry, you don't get any, that type of thing. Yeah.
What if you get a patient who comes in who has, I know this is taboo right now, but the term brain death applies to the patient.
Yeah.
And they have a living will that stipulates that they don't want you to do those things to keep them physically
Alive. You don't have to. You have to, you can't.
Maybe I can just limit it to just, let's say, hydration, intravenous fluids, basically.
Then you'd have to get, basically what it comes down to is that, it basically comes down to this. You can't starve and dehydrate people to death. And you can't be complicit in that. So the answer is they don't have a right to ask for it. Now, on a practical level, it may be impossible for you to stop that type of thing from happening, but you should not be the doctor that commands it, because then you engage in the formal cooperation. What you should do is say, you're going to have to get a different physician because I can't do this. And then in that case, if a physician in conscience feels he can do it, well, then that's his responsibility. But and normally you should make a reasonable effort too to look to people to fraternally correct them. If you recognize, no, really you should have them on the hydration. So we won't do anything else. And usually people who are brain dead don't last long anyway, without all sorts of other things. So by the term brain dead, I mean there's cessation of. I don't think they mean they're really dead. The whole person's dead, but. In that particular case, I would just say, no, we'll have to continue the nutrition. But again, if they're going to die within 24 hours or whatever the case is, I think that you can withhold it. But outside of that, I'd say you'd say, I can't be involved in this. And then the hospital's got to be the one to assign the person, and you just avoid any cooperation in it. So, that might sound difficult, but when I get to the nurses stuff, people have to be really careful, because this cooperation stuff is a serious problem today. And you just can't cooperate in what people want to do with themselves. If they want to starve themselves to death, you may not be able to stop it, but you can't be any part of it. Yeah.
Just kind of an addendum, I would recommend too that medical doctors would talk to their legislators and tell them that they need that rights of conscience legislation.
Yeah.
Particularly for this case.
Yeah.
Well, too,
Yeah, because sometimes you get into these hospitals and they say you will do what you're this X, Y, or Z, based upon your contract. And part of the problem is that's one of my cousin who does research in biochemistry. He was offered rather large six-figure sums to do research for virtually all the different pharmaceutical companies wanted to come to work for him. But when you sign on the dotted line, it means you're going to do what they tell you to do, and he just says, I couldn't do that in conscience. And that's what you have to be really careful with. And also this, in Lincoln, what they've done is that Catholic doctors have kind of banded together to create their own little atmosphere so they don't have to deal with these things. And that's one of the ways, that can be one of the ways to do it if the means are possible for people. But you're right. Ask the legislator for the exemption, their conscientious objection clauses. Yeah.
You mentioned the use of having people designate the power of attorney for their healthcare decisions over a living will. And someone also mentioned that they should be supplemented as some understanding of natural law.
Yeah.
What would be a good reference to send those people to? Because I can't sit down in the office and people elect that just
yes. I mean, people are lucky you survived this. No, you're right. Once in a while, there's a difference between what they call a living will and a will to live. A will to live very often delineates those things. I want to live based on ordinary means in these particular circumstances, and sometimes you can direct them to those. Usually what I would do is if I were you, if they're Catholic, I would just say, go talk to a good priest who knows these matters, and he can sit down and tell you what you can and cannot do. Because I'm hesitant to say, well, go talk to the chancery, because a lot of these chanceries aren't up on the cutting edge aspects of this, and so they'll just say, oh yeah, that's fine, that's fine, that's fine. They don't really know. So that's usually what I would recommend people to do. So if worse comes to worse and you can't find anybody, you could send them to, you could have them email me or something. And sometimes too, if you just delineate, these are always required, the nutrition and hydration, all this other stuff isn't. And then people can pick and choose on what they want and the stuff that isn't required. But you just have to make sure they don't pick and choose among the stuff that they're not permitted to pick and choose against. So sometimes that helps. Nutrition, hydration, that's always required. But all the other stuff is not required, so tell them that, you want this or that done. But the other thing is, too, is, don't tell them to do things that are going to cause your death, like, overdosing you with morphine or starving you to death or whatever the case is. Yeah.
There is a Catholic Medical Association, and these are similar precepts that they have, because they're in line with the conventional Catholic thought on this.
Right.
Their positions are well thought out. They have position papers on many of these things on the available, so you can refer to Catholic Medical.
Okay.